Hello there, welcome to today's presentation. My name is Martin Speller, I work for the OPF as a project manager, and I'll be covering the first two parts of today's agenda, which is the overview and the community stewardship. Um, when I finish those, I'll pass over to Carl Wilson, who will run through a set of PAR use cases. Thanks, Becky. Okay, today's webinar will in fact be the first of a series of 3 PAR-related presentations and workshops that we'll be going over in the course of the next few weeks. The focus of today's presentation is very much on release 0.3. So John, Jack and Matthew will run through a detailed demo, which will be in the form of a demo a little bit further on in the presentation. After that, Justin will provide an overview of the second PAR presentation, which will be a workshop that we expect to run somewhere around June. That interactive workshop will provide an opportunity for you to get directly involved with PAR by helping us define future development features. That workshop is also going to be covering a review of the PAR data model, and there'll also be some associated group work, interactive group work in that session as well. So the third and final presentation that we'll do of this series will cover release 0.4 of PAR software, and that will cover the detailed feature list and the means by which you can get directly involved with those development tasks associated with 0.4. And we'll also take the opportunity to go and present to you the long-term PAR roadmap as well. So that should be really interesting. So make sure you sign up in good time. So next slide, please, Becky. Okay, presenting today are members of the PAR core team. So that's John and Jack from Preservica, Matthew from Arkivum, Justin from Artefactual, Becky, Carl and myself from the OPF. So the second part of today's presentation will cover the PAR Community Stewardship. So as some of you may know, the stewardship for PAR has to date been under the control of JISC. They provided the initial funding that enabled PAR to get to the point that it is today. And currently that includes the development of a feature-rich API, an endpoint browser, and an API implementation that spans Preservica, Arkivum and Archivematica DP systems. So we've decided now that 0.3 releases in a firm footing, the ongoing stewardship of PAR is going to be transferred to the OPF. There's a number of reasons for that, but primarily it's because we want to try and provide a more independent technical oversight and a means to coordinate our collective tasks. So we figure that OPF would be in a good position to do that. And also based on OPF's experience, we're keen to expand the community knowledge and involvement with PAR via events like this, so through webinars and workshops. Definitely we want to involve greater community input, particularly with some development tasks, and we'd look to do that via things like hack weeks. And in some cases, maybe as the providers of best practice trusted sources, and I'm sure that's something we'll cover a little bit later on. So as part of this stewardship, there's a number of things that OPF will be doing. So first thing will be, we're going to create a new GitHub repo. So that's going to replace the existing repo, and the new one will be known as Open Preserve PAR Core. That will happen within the next 4 weeks. New repo will act as a central repository for all of our source material. It will house the parcore.org website, which we're aware certainly needs updating, so that will be a task for us to take on board fairly shortly. It will house all the PAR API documentation. There are a couple of other things that we'll also be doing. That will include creating a new Slack channel, which will be PARcore, and very much putting an emphasis on community involvement with what we're doing going forward. So just would like, on behalf of the PARcore team, say a really big special thank you to JISC for all of their support in the early stages of PAR to help it get off the ground and for their ongoing help and encouragement. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Carl.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So I'm not going to speak for too long. I'm just going to run over 3 slides, just showing some of the use cases we imagine or envisage for PARs, some areas where it might be of use. First, a quick overview of a PAR ecosystem. This is for people who haven't been to one of the previous webinars or don't know what PAR is about at all. So the purpose of the PAR, which PAR standing for Preservation Action Registries, is to facilitate sharing preservation actions between disparate DP systems. So it's a way of sharing, in fact, I'll read the second one and then I'll talk a little bit. So yeah, allow well-formed preservation workflows such as a set of compounded preservation actions to be imported from an external trusted source for use within your local environment. But put more simply, it's a way of software that deals with concepts, digital preservation concepts such as file formats, preservation tools, preservation actions. So this includes repository software like Artefactual and Preservica, but also potentially other software tools and registry browsers. But the idea is all these entities can offer a standard API, and this API supports a set of core model concepts, things like formats, tools, preservation actions, and all of these endpoints can both advertise their own contents and also read and download the contents of other registries. So the idea is that you can browse other people's registries, see what you like that they're doing, see the things that don't interest you, but then you can actually download and try the things you like on your local system. And this diagram here gives you an idea of the kind of registries. So on the bottom line, there are a set of different PAR registries. These are just examples, but the one on the left would be wrapping around Wikidata's repository of information to provide a standard PAR endpoint. Then there's the repository systems from our partners. And the final box would be third party. And then the top, they all can communicate with each other over the PAR standard API. And then there's a set of tools on the top. These are examples of the kind of tools that might also communicate with PAR. So one is a registry browser, so you can see what different users have in their registries. A tool to actually synchronize between registries if you decided you were going to follow a particular source of expertise, then you could set up synchronization between the registries. Okay, then, let's go to the next slide, please, Becky. Thanks. So these are a few of the use cases that we've been talking through ourselves. We have quite a long list, but these are the ones we selected for the presentation. So the first one would be simply the updating of file format signatures. So a lot of you will be familiar with Droid and Fido, which are the format identification tools from the National Archive and the OPF. And both of these are based on Pronom, which is a database of file formats information, in fact, other digital preservation information, but primarily thought as a source of file format information and the source of Pronom IDs and format signatures. And now that data is of high quality, but there can be sometimes long gaps between signature file releases, and that can mean that it takes time for new format signatures to make it into people's software. Now, for a PAR solution, what would have to happen is we're talking to the National Archives about the possibilities of producing a PAR endpoints for Pronom, and that would allow other PAR clients to query Pronom and see not just the Pronom, the file format data that's in there, but also to make queries based on data. You could actually find out what were the new format signatures since you had last queried the Pronom database. But also it would also be possible for other sources of file format data and signatures to produce a PAR endpoint. So you could then, in theory, take signature data from either a different source, or you could trial Pronom signatures in something like WikiDP using a PAR endpoint wrapped around that weren't in Pronom. So a way of actually speeding up the Pronom development cycle slightly. And obviously to do this, the signature tools themselves, Droid and Fido, would also need a PAR read API to be able to query endpoints and download new signatures from them. But yeah, as I say, this would allow some kind of choice of signature formats, signature sources. and would allow signature information to be shared a little bit more freely. Next slide, please, Becky. Another related use case is to do with the recharacterization of a particular collection. And it's a familiar problem in digital preservation that as tools become are updated and improved, there can sometimes be the need to revisit collections. In this case, we're really imagining the update of the signature file again. But this would actually provide not just the new signatures, but a trigger to say that the signature file has been updated. There's the potential to identify files that weren't previously identified and to rerun the tool upon a collection, to looking at files that weren't previously identified, to try to see whether the new signatures, like pick any of the unidentified files up. And again, to make this happen, the repository, your repository would need a PAR API to be able to query the signature information. And then, but once new signatures are available, the PAR system would be able to download them, update the identification tool, and then trigger a rerun across a particular collection. Next slide, please, Becky. And finally, this one doesn't have a diagram, but the idea here is that you can, a mature PAR ecosystem would allow people to learn from good practice from trusted sources. So we envisage an ecosystem where, as well as some of the large national libraries and archives, there would be small organizations, for instance, format expert organizations, such as an example, the PDF Association, who specialized in a particular type of data and they could advertise particular preservation actions that they approved of for particular formats, for instance, the conversion of a document type between document types, or the conversion of PDFs to PDFAs, for example. And the idea here would be that newcomers in particular, but anyone working in digital preservation, could browse some of the repositories of organizations that they trust or they believe they're interested to see how they're dealing with similar problems, look at the tools and setups that they're using in their real systems, and then at the press of the button, download and deploy them to a local system and test them themselves and even make a live deployment. Now, there may be one or two wrinkles in that around installing software tools in the first place, but once software is installed, it would be easy to exchange configurations and good practice. Yeah, and I think that covers the 3 use cases that, from my slides, and I'll hand over for the demonstration.
Hi, thanks, Carl. So if you've sat in on one of our previous webinars or talks or been to one of our workshops, this is probably just going to be a bit of a recap first slide. But I wanted to just remind everyone and introduce some of the key components in the PAR data model. So this isn't everything, but the sort of key ones that we wanted to highlight include file formats, which we've been talking about already in this webinar. So they're effectively modeled on the pronom definition of what a file format is. We have the idea of tools, which effectively describe software tools that can perform digital preservation actions. They also allow you to declare constraints on sort of environmental requirements for those tools. So in future, this could help preservation systems to determine whether or not they're going to be able to run a specific action by looking at the tool definition and deciding whether they meet those environmental requirements. We have preservation actions, which describe how a particular tool can be invoked and how the output of running that tool can be interpreted. So this allows you to provide details of all the parameters that you might require in order to run a particular tool in a particular way, how to do things like actually measure the output properties that that tool is able to give you based on the text or the XML or the JSON output that that tool generates. Or if it's a migration action, you'd be looking at things like what input files are required to run this and what set of output files you might expect to be created. And then sitting above these is business rules, which effectively provide some context around which you should be running preservation actions. So in what circumstances are you going to run your particular preservation action? So business rules allow you to do things like declare that a particular migration action can be run against files of a particular file format, but only for certain types of transformations. So you might say that a migration action should only be run to create new access copies or to perform a normalization. And because these components interlink, so business rules apply preservation actions, they're controlled by file formats, preservation actions actually execute tools, and so on. The API that PAR defines also defines a rich set of filters that allow you to really see how that data connects. And we'll be able to see how we can use those filters in some of the later videos on. So one of the other resources that we maintain in the project is a Swagger specification of the API. And that allows you to create documentation like you're seeing here. So it's nice, usable, and if it's configured against a real system, it can even be interactive. So these try it out buttons, if you're running it against a real system, can actually work. And what you're seeing here is the API documentation running against a Preservica implementation of the API. And so when we run those try it out buttons and we search for the details on a format like FMT40, we can see that it's a Microsoft Word document, and we can really see all of the information coming back out. And this documentation defines all of the methods, all of the endpoints, all of those filters that you can start to apply to those requests in order to get a linked up picture of how all of these different components interact with each other. So the same API can be implemented by multiple different systems with different data, and the next few videos that we're going to walk through will show you how you can make use of that.
Thanks, Jack. So yeah, so this is a standardized GUI that is now looking at a particular endpoint, which in this case happens to be Preservica. So we can see the name of the server it's connected to here. And we can confirm that, and we can say, let's page through all the formats. And as we know, this is a copy of Pronom plus Preservica extensions. So that's 2,000 odd formats, is too many to page through. So let's find a specific format that we're interested in. Let's look at that format 40 that Jack showed in the Swagger documentation. And this shows the JSON turned into human readable form. So the information about Word, its related formats, its signatures, etc. But we can also say, what can I do with Word? So let's look at the business rules for Word 95. And sure enough, we can see there are lots of different rules. And one of those is migrate or normalizing to PDF, which is a fairly standard thing to do with something like Word. And we can see with the business rule that does that, which formats it applies to. So the same business rule is used for lots of different formats, including Word. And then we can look at the preservation action to do that, which is the specific configuration. We can see it uses LibreOffice. We can see all the parameters that go into running LibreOffice to do that business rule. And we can look at LibreOffice itself, and we can see which version we're using and how it's set up. We can also see what other actions we use with LibreOffice. And we can see there's quite a lot of other actions that can be explored. We can say, well, what other migrations do you have on the system? So here are a lot of different migration actions we have. Sure enough, there's a migrate to web-ready MP4 for videos. We can see that uses FFmpeg. and we can see how FFmpeg is set up. So this is all interlinked and allows you to explore any particular registry. We can look at all the preservation actions, and here are the ones for metadata extraction. And we can see all the different metadata extraction preservation actions. Here is, we're going to look at one for PDF. So this uses extract PDF. It uses the Jove PDF tool, and you can see all the XPath data that's used to extract properties and put them into Preservica in this instance. And we can then look at how Jove PDF is set up. We see what else we can do with Jove PDF, and sure enough, it's also used to validate PDFs. But in this instance, the output is a true false rather than the metadata values, which is semantically different. So we can see how the Preservica registry is available to be inspected by anyone who wants to have a look at it and look at its content, look at how it's linked at, and compare how we do things to how other people do things. So this GUI was quickly put together as a bit of PHP to demonstrate that we can turn what is, whilst many people on this call will speak JSON, many people will not and would prefer to see it in HTML form so they can interlink it and navigate the content. But of course, that is sat on top of an absolutely standard API. And so the other instance of that standard API should also be able to share their data with an identical GUI code. So that's what we're going to look at now. And we'll look at Arkivmatica with the same GUI.
Hey, hi, so this is Justin. So this is a video that shows that same GUI tool being used to browse through another server. This time it's an Arkivmatica server that has a tool that we've developed called FPR to PAR, which provides a PAR API on top of an Arkivmatica database. So in the same information, same kind of information is stored in Arkivmatica's database that you would find in a Preservica system. But this tool now shows, because we're using PAR, we're able to, browse it using this same. We're translating Arkivmatica's internal format policy registry concepts into PAR entities. So we've looked at a particular format, and now we're finding, Arkivmatica has a business rule defined that has a string of actions that are taken to normalize this raw camera image format that we're looking at. You can kind of look at the detail of the tool that's used to do that preservation action. You can look at other tools that are used for the same preservation action type, all the same kind of information that we saw in the last video with data coming from Preservica instance. The way that Arkivmatica maps this, in this particular FPR to PAR tool we're using to provide this API, the way it maps Arkivmatica's internal data structures into PAR might be slightly different than what you see in Preservica, and that's one of the things we want to talk about in the upcoming workshops, which we'll talk about later. But you can still get, you can really see that the same basic open source tools are used in both of these preservation systems, but you can now kind of look through and find the differences between how each of these preservation systems maybe run the tools or under what conditions they run the tools. Here we're looking at the details of a particular preservation action type, so the various preservation actions that are available for extracting content. Look at the tool available to do this with 7-zip. Again, this information is available in Arkivmatica's GUI, but by having a read-only API like this available, it's possible to compare across different preservation systems and really learn from how things are done in each system.
Okay, so I'm going to talk through how we're using preservation action registries at Arkivum. And Arkivum, we use Arkivmatica as the digital preservation engine in our Perpetua product. And along with the preservation capabilities that you've just seen from Justin that come from the community release of Arkivmatica, we had some further preservation actions of our own. So for example, this is a workflow we've added for the preservation of PST email archives. And PST archives get extracted into folders of individual emails in EML format. These in turn have their file attachments extracted, so images, documents, PowerPoints, etc. The file attachments are then normalized into preservation versions, for example, PDF files. Then the whole lot, including the original PST file, is assembled into an AIP that's optionally zipped up. Now, of course, that's all lovely, but the real question is, how do we go from a pretty picture like this to explaining to our users and the wider community what's happening in detail, and in a way that they can compare with other preservation systems? And that, of course, is where PAR comes in. Next one. So the high-level workflow I just showed can be expressed in terms of a series of PAR preservation actions. So each step in that workflow is a preservation action. For example, the first action in this case is extracting emails from a PST file. The action has a type defined by premise, which is unpacking. The action acts upon a set of files of a given format, so PSTs, and it produces outputs. So one or more EML files. And that same idea applies to all the other actions in the workflow that are chained together. And the chaining is done using Arkivumatica's built-in workflow. I won't go into detail into the rest of the actions, as it's easier to show you in the demo. But before I do, a quick, next slide. Before I do, a quick shout out to Artefactual for producing the great tool FPR to PAR that Justin just mentioned. And that allows Arkivmatica users to share their Arkivmatica format policy registries in PAR format and over a PAR API for others to access. And we're using this at Arkivum to run a demo PAR server that supports the PAR API that you'll see in the demo. The demo goes quite quickly, so hopefully I'll keep up. First thing we do is we point the PAR GUI at the Arkivum PAR demo server. And this is publicly accessible, and it contains Arkivum's extensions to the Arkivmatica community release. And when we've done that, we can browse by preservation action type and have a look at the preservation actions that involve extracting content from files. Normally they're used for zips and tars, but we've added extraction of PST email archives. And from there, we can navigate to the tools which are used. I mean, in this case, it's read PST run as a command line application. Likewise, if we go back to the extraction actions, we can see another action that's used to extract file attachments from individual emails. In this case, using a Python tool that Arkivum's written. And then finally, going back to preservation action types again, we can look at some of the normalization actions. And here Arkivum has added actions to convert various Office formats such as documents and PowerPoints into PDF. So for example, if an email had a Microsoft Word document as an attachment, then the corresponding normalization action would be triggered, which in this case converts it into PDF. And the underlying tools in that case were LibreOffice, just as John showed as being used in Preservica, but we then go from the PDF that produced into PDF-A using GhostScript. So we've got several tools combined together. So hopefully what I've now shown you is how we've gone all the way from a high-level workflow for email preservation through to a detailed series of PAR preservation actions that have been shared in an open format using the PAR API. And I'm going to hand back to Justin, I think.
Yep. Hello. So we're going to talk now about next steps that we have planned for working on the PAR schema or PAR definition. So we're planning through the OPF to host an interactive workshop online in June. At that webinar, we're planning to test out the PAR model in more detail. So we held a in-person workshop through the OPF and DPC last June in York in the UK. And so this will be kind of an online version of that, but specifically geared towards helping to set or refine and set the requirements for 0.4 version of the PAR schema and PAR API. So this webinar will be, it is fundamentally a technical webinar, but we're not expecting anyone to have any requirement of a particular coding skills or to perform technical work during the workshop. This is really about talking about PAR as a conceptual model, talk about the data model of it, and look at what the best next steps are. So these questions here are the kinds of things we're hoping people will be able to think about during the workshop and come away with a better idea of. You can go to the next slide. So here's an example. This is a rough overview of the agenda of that workshop that we're planning to have. So we'll start off by going through the PAR data model and describing the entities that are there. So we've been touching on things like preservation actions and business rules. We'll also talk about file and object and preservation action type and the other entities that exist in that model and why they're there and how they relate to each other. We'll then work through some examples designed as interactively as possible to kind of show some PAR, some real life examples written up as PAR. So we want to be able to discuss those and look at them and see what changes need to be made to the PAR schema, what improvements to the PAR API to make it easier to search through or to find this information might help in these specific examples. And then we will go through the roadmap, the issues that have been filed in our GitHub repository and plans that the various participants in the PAR project are thinking about working on for the 0.4 version of PAR, and then sort of a longer range discussion after that. You can go to the next slide. So we just have here a couple of examples of the kind of thing when we go through examples of PAR. This is a example from a previous workshop where we went through and looked at a command for running media info for doing metadata extraction on a QuickTime video and outputting eView core. So we'll go through in the workshop what these various properties are. These are the properties of a preservation action filled out for this particular example, and why they're there. You note there's an ID here with a particular number. If you go to the next slide. Here's an example of a business rule, and it has a property called preservation actions, which links to that previous preservation action like we just showed. So this is the kind of thing we want to go through and make all of this understandable and talk about what properties are missing from business rules or preservation actions, or what what are potential improvements in how this model has been put together that could be developed. And that's it.
Yeah, so it's worth saying that the GUI that we demoed, we're intending to make that available so people can, well, we'll make it available as open source in the fullness of time once we've done a little bit more finishing off of the APIs that we've got. But we'll hopefully stand up a GUI that you can pick to look at Preservica, Arkivum, or Artefactual, and just go and look at it and see what it shows. Just as an example to get people excited. I think in previous workshops we've had, it's all been very theoretical. Now these things actually work and actually exist and are actually being used to exchange data. So this is stop being theory and starting to become practice. But we're very keen for as many people to get to participate as possible in that process, so that it really does become community-led. But we'll be standing up a GUI to make sure you can see that it actually is real and that you're actually getting some benefit from looking at it and comparing systems and contrasting, and to encourage people to then participate, improve, and enhance.
This is Justin again. I have one other comment just to add in. We're focusing quite a bit at the moment in the interoperability that PAR provides, and I think that's one of the most compelling use cases for why all of us here have been involved in the project. We're very interested in making it possible for reduce the learning curve for being able to work on defining new preservation actions, as you can see by poking around in these APIs, the tools that are used are the same across preservation systems. It's really the knowledge about whether to use FFmpeg or whether to use ImageMagick is not unique to any one preservation system. The things that are different about preservation systems are more about the workflows or about other aspects. But we really want this part to be shared. But there are also a couple of other aspects of PAR that, you know, in the model we also want to be able to use PAR to help describe more complex preservation actions. So things that happen on sets of files, objects. So a data set that has 1,000 CSV files and 1 codebook. The way that preservation systems work now, focused on sort of file format based preservation actions, can't really do that. And PAR modeling provides us an opportunity to be able to start modeling those more complex preservation actions. And then the other ideas with the business rules is about being able to capture context. Why are you choosing these preservation actions and not doing it some other way? Which is often difficult to discern when looking at the settings of a preservation system. But at this point in the process, we're really, as I said, focusing on this interoperability aspect. So there's a question here about, in the chat, I'm noticing someone asking, are these systems able to be used by art gallery CMS systems? Well, the idea is that the PAR API is has an open API spec or Swagger specification for it. So it would absolutely be possible for an art gallery CMS system vendor to implement that API to provide that way of accessing information within their system, assuming that you know, the mapping between how it's the preservation activities within that system are currently modeled, you know, can be mapped to PAR to the PAR model. But that's actually the whole idea, is that we don't want this API to be just used within Archivum and Preservica. It's an open standard or an open specification that we're hoping other people will adopt.
And whilst we can't mandate this, we would encourage people who consume, in other words, read the content of our registries, to also share theirs. Because it's a community thing, and it should be, we shouldn't have people who are just reading our stuff and then going away and using it. Well, no, they can do that. There's nothing stopping them do that. But we really would encourage it to be an exchange so that we all learn. You know, there are things in, for example, a CMS sim that might have some, a gallery system that might have some clever things to do with digital art, or much better ways of doing very, very high quality art transforms that we could learn from, to do with color spaces that we don't know about. So if we could learn from the work they do, and they can learn from the work we do, everyone's winning and everyone's moving forward much quicker, which is the whole intention of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and there's a lot of transparency that you get from using PAR that you wouldn't otherwise have. I mean, in answer to the question, I mean, preservation systems are already in use by art galleries, and that's true across Artefactual, Arkivum, and I'm sure Preservica too. We've all got customers in that area. The problem that those guys have is it's difficult to compare what they're getting between preservation systems. And of course, PAR provides that transparency so they can then see exactly what's happening in the different options that they have from commercial vendors or open source solutions. So it's a great leveler, I think.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I have a question.
Yeah.
You can, wonderful. Paul Stokes here from JISC. Martin and others have made quite clear how people can get involved both in specifying use cases and hackathons and workshops and so on. What happens if you're a systems vendor? How would you get involved on that level?
So I can take a first stab at answering that. So, I mean, one way a systems vendor could be involved is helping to implement this PAR API as part of their your service offering, and look at, you know, the mapping of your current internal data structure to the PAR model, and possibly suggest ways in which the PAR model could, you know, better adapt, better help you express your current data.
Yeah, and just join, you know, contact OPF and say, can I play, please? You know, nice people. We want as many as possible in this. We don't want to just be a cabal with us three. We want 20 or 30 or 40 or 100 members of the PAR consortium. You know, as many as possible.
I'll take a stab at answering Chris's question from the chat here.
Yeah.
Chris has asked, you know, what is not clear to me is how the information is getting back into my DP. So the PAR API defines read actions, like get actions, as well as writing actions, posting. But in this demonstration today, we've been showing just read-only access to APIs, and you know, it is possible, and we've done this in previous demonstrations, to download a preservation action from one preservation system, and then if you have access to a system and you're authorized to do posts, or to write information into another system, you could theoretically post that PAR schema, that PAR JSON into into an Arkivum instance. You originally downloaded it from Preservica and you posted into Arkivum. That's not necessarily something that's fully implemented. It's certainly not fully implemented in Arkivum right now. You can do very proof of concept posts, but only in a development branch. But the idea of PAR itself is to support that, and then that becomes a question of what authorization do you want to allow. Going into this next question, the software systems that we're demonstrating here are demo systems. So it's absolutely, most preservation systems that people run are not necessarily online and available to the general public. It's possible, like the FPR to PAR tool that we developed to be able to provide this APR for Arkivum actually runs as a standalone tool separate from an Arkivum instance. So you could choose to install that tool on the same server as an Arkivum, your running Arkivum system. You could install it on a separate server, have a copy of your data, of your sort of preservation actions in it, completely separate so that there's no public access to your digital preservation system. So the way you implement this stuff is there's lots of control that we're just in this webinar showing examples and working with demonstration systems to show the potential.
Yeah, so at the recent Preservica user group, it was slightly out the scope of this webinar, but we could show that we could update the registry and then trigger a recharacter, which was updating a file format specification, and then triggering a recharacterization of formats that would be influenced by that change, and to show that it had picked up that change and that things were now identifying differently. So we did have the ability, using the GUI I showed in a very simple way, to just update the registry, because it's read-write. You can have a GUI like the one I showed as a registry editor, as a generic registry editor that can edit any registry regardless of the back end. And we were able to show that and also trigger the actions, the reclassification, re-identification actions that would follow on from that. So that's all possible once you've got the PAR standard across all the platforms.
I just wanted to go back to that question about digital preservation systems having to be open accessible on the web. I mean, as Justin said, you don't have to make the whole preservation system open, only the preservation detail or a description of the preservation actions that the system performs. And that's exactly what we do at Arkivum. So the digital preservation systems we host for our customers certainly aren't web accessible, but that demonstration that you just saw does have a publicly accessible version of the preservation actions that those systems perform. So it is entirely possible to share information on what preservation actions are being done without having to open up the whole digital preservation environment.
Yeah, and in a multi-tenant environment, of course, you'll have many tenants sharing the same registry. So that's an extra sort of dissociation between registry information and individual tenants within a multi-tenant environment.
Yes.
So that separation between the content and the registry that determines the preservation actions that will be performed on that content.
Yes, and then different tenants may have different preservation actions that they want to use in their context, using their business rules that won't be used for other tenants. So there could be different registries for different tenants, even within a multi-tenanted environment.
Or each tenant can select which business rules they want to apply to their content.
Yep.
You could the business rules become the art of the possible, and then the users determine which of those they actually want to apply. So once we've got all the information, it can be implemented differently by each platform, and that's great because we're sort of looking at different usability models rather than sort of reinventing the wheel over how to run FFmpeg on AVI files, which is a duplication that's not the best use of our time.
There is one further question here about the, I believe it's asking about, will the online workshop have information for people who are starting about how to use different types of software? I think that the focus of our workshop in June will be about the PAR data model and the PAR schemas, PAR API. We will definitely show demonstrations of how you can use the tools that we've shown today to interact with both Archivum, Preservica, or potentially other systems, but I won't be focused on sort of teaching people about how to use preservation systems themselves.
I mean, that is the whole point of PAR, that it should be able to be used with all preservation systems. So the examples we've shown just happen to be the ones it's been implemented for so far. And hopefully that list will grow.
And also like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to our presenters, John, Justin, Carl, Jack, Martin and Matthew. And thank you very much to all of you for attending. So yeah, that's it for today. And we hope we'll see some of you at our workshop.